John Wayne was 18 minutes into the best interview he had given in years when the backstage door opened and Henry Fonda walked through it. It was February the 19th, 1979. The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson was taping at NBC Studios in Burbank, California. In the guest chair to Johnny's right, wearing a dark brown Western blazer and the easy, weathered grin that had defined American cinema for 5 decades, John Wayne was in the middle of a story about his latest checkup at the Mayo Clinic, the kind of story only John Wayne could tell with profanity and laughter and the casual bravado of a man who treated cancer the way most men treated a difficult meeting. 308 people in the studio audience were laughing with him. Johnny Carson was leaning forward on his desk, his chin in his hand, grinning the way he always grinned when a guest was truly at ease, which was rarer than the audience ever knew. The cameras were rolling. The orchestra had settled into a quiet hum. Everything in Studio One was exactly where it was supposed to be. Then the door opened, and the room changed. I see messages all the time in the comment section that some of you did not realize you did not subscribe, so if you could do me a favor and double-check if you are a subscriber to this channel, that would be tremendously appreciated. It is simple. It is a free thing that anybody who watches this show frequently can do to help us keep everything going in the direction it is going. So please do double-check if you have subscribed, and thank you so much, because in a strange way you are part of our history and you are on this journey with us, and I appreciate you for that. Henry Fonda walked out of the backstage corridor at 5:47 in the afternoon, and the moment he cleared the curtain, the entire studio held its breath. Not because of who Henry Fonda was, though that was considerable. He was one of the great actors of the 20th century, a man who had carried the weight of American decency on screen for 40 years, from Tom Joad to Mr. Roberts to the juror in 12 Angry Men who simply would not stop asking questions. The audience knew him, they loved him, but that was not why the breath went out of the room. The breath went out of the room because of who was already on that stage. John Wayne and Henry Fonda had not shared a public stage in living memory. And there was a reason for that. The reason had a name. It was spelled with 7 letters, and it had taken more than 50,000 American lives and broken something in the country that had not fully healed yet, not in 1979 and not for many years after. The reason was Vietnam. And every single person in that studio, from the camera operators to the security guard who had tried to stop Fonda at the service entrance and found himself standing aside without entirely understanding why, every single person understood without being told that something was about to happen on this stage that had nothing to do with entertainment. John Wayne saw him first. He was mid-sentence, something about the clinic's coffee being indistinguishable from motor oil, when his eyes tracked to the wings the way a man's eyes always track movement he is not expecting, and the sentence simply stopped. Did not trail off, did not finish, stopped. John Wayne sat in the chair and looked at Henry Fonda walking toward the desk, and he said nothing for 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds every camera in Studio One caught a look on John Wayne's face that no director had ever captured in over 200 films. It was not anger. It was not surprise, exactly. It was something closer to the expression a man wears when the thing he has been rehearsing for a long time is finally beginning. Johnny Carson stood up. He stood up the way you stand up when something is happening that you do not have language for yet, a reflex of the body before the mind has had its say. He looked at Henry Fonda. He looked at John Wayne. He put both hands flat on the desk. "Hank," he said. That was all he said for the next 11 seconds. To understand what happened that night in Studio One, you have to go back. Not to Vietnam, though we will get there. Further back, you have to go to 2 boys born within a year of each other in the early part of the last century, one in Iowa and one in the state that would eventually become a battleground for the exact argument they were about to have on national television, a boy named Henry James Fonda, born in Grand Island, Nebraska, in May of 1905, and a boy named Marion Robert Morrison, born in Winterset, Iowa, in May of 1907, 2 Midwestern boys, 2 boys who grew up knowing the smell of farmland and the silence of the prairie and the particular loneliness of the American interior. They would spend their entire adult lives being mistaken for the same thing, the sturdy moral backbone of American cinema, the face of the honest man. They would spend the last decade of the 20th century's third quarter being mistaken for each other's enemy. Neither of them was wrong. Neither of them was entirely right. That was what made the argument so terrible, and that was what would eventually make the photograph so devastating. You have to understand who John Wayne was before Vietnam, because the man who made the Green Berets in 1968 was not the man who showed up in Hollywood in 1926 as a prop boy on the Fox film lot. That man was a kid from Iowa named Marion Morrison who wanted to be a football player until a shoulder injury took the scholarship and left him at the age of 19 with nothing but a willingness to work and a face the camera could not stop looking at. John Ford saw him carrying equipment across a set and told him he moved wrong for an actor, which was Ford's way of saying he had never seen anyone move quite like that in his life. Morrison changed his name to John Wayne at Ford's suggestion and spent the next decade in poverty wages and cheap westerns until Stagecoach made him a star in 1939, and he never stopped working after that. But here is the thing nobody talks about when they talk about John Wayne in Vietnam. Here is the crack in the monument. In 1942, when the United States entered World War II and virtually every major Hollywood actor with two functioning legs either enlisted or found a way to serve, John Wayne did not go. He was 34 years old and legally eligible. He had a family, it was true, 4 children and a failing marriage, and the particular terror of a man who has just become famous and cannot bear to lose it, and he requested deferments, not 1, not 2, 3 deferments. And the draft board, whether out of deference to his value to the war effort on screen or simply because the paperwork moved slowly, granted them. John Wayne spent World War II making movies about soldiers while other men, including Henry Fonda, went to war. Henry Fonda did not have to go. He was 37 years old in 1942, with 2 young children and a career at its peak. He did not have to go, and he went anyway. He enlisted as a regular sailor, refused an officer's commission because he did not want special treatment, and served in the Pacific for 3 years, earning a Bronze Star and a Presidential Unit Citation before he came home in 1945, thinner and quieter than he had left. He never talked about it. Not publicly, not in interviews, not in the way some men talked about the war to define themselves. He simply went and came back and went back to work and said nothing, which is itself a kind of statement. John Wayne, meanwhile, had spent those same 3 years making some of the most iconic American war films in cinema history. Sands of Iwo Jima, Flying Tigers, The Fighting Seabees. He wore the uniform on screen with a conviction that was absolutely genuine because he believed in the cause with everything he had, and it was exactly that genuine conviction that made the gap between the performance and the reality so difficult to look at directly. He believed in the war. He was just not in it. And somewhere inside the chest of Marion Robert Morrison from Winterset, Iowa, underneath all the bravado and the swagger and the $42 million at the box office, that knowledge sat like a stone he could never fully set down. Wait. Do not miss this detail, because it is the only way to understand why he made the Green Berets. And the Green Berets is the only way to understand why Henry Fonda walked through that door. By 1966, Vietnam had become the American argument, not a policy debate, not a strategic disagreement. The argument, the thing that divided fathers from sons and neighborhoods from themselves and the country from any settled sense of what it believed about itself. John Wayne watched this happen, and he felt something that is difficult to describe if you have not felt it yourself, a kind of nausea that comes when the thing you understand most about the world starts to look, in the eyes of the people around you, like the very thing they are fighting against. He believed in America's right and responsibility to oppose communism. He believed in the soldiers. He had always believed in the soldiers. And now those soldiers were coming home to airports where people called them names, and the newspapers were full of arguments about whether the whole enterprise was wrong, and the country was dividing itself along lines that made no sense to him. So he did the only thing John Wayne knew how to do when something mattered to him absolutely. He put his own money in. He co-directed and starred in the Green Berets in 1968, a film so nakedly, unabashedly pro-war that critics savaged it with a particular venom usually reserved for personal offense. Because it was personal. To everyone, the New York Times called it morally and factually indefensible. The film made $40 million at the box office, and John Wayne did not care what the critics said, except that he did, because criticism always found the thing you already feared about yourself and pressed there. Henry Fonda never made a statement about the Green Berets. He did not need to. He had already said everything he needed to say by going to Washington and standing quietly in a crowd of veterans and Gold Star mothers who were asking the government to explain itself. He had said everything by refusing. When reporters asked him about his daughter Jane's activism, to either endorse it or condemn it, a silence that was itself a position, and that John Wayne heard as clearly as if it had been printed in the newspaper. What you have seen so far is not the whole story. The part nobody knew is coming now, and it is the part that changes everything. On October the 14th, 1972, John Wayne drove himself to St. Mary's Hospital in Anaheim, California. He was not ill. He was not visiting a friend. He had been invited quietly, without press, by a chaplain who worked on the veterans ward and who had been writing to Wayne for 3 months about the men coming home from Vietnam who needed something that the medical staff could not give them. Wayne had said yes, the way he always said yes to things involving soldiers, and he arrived alone, without his publicist or his manager or anyone who might have thought to call a photographer. He spent 4 hours on the ward that night. He sat next to beds. He held hands. He listened. He did not make speeches. He did not bring cameras. He did not tell anyone that John Wayne was there. He just sat with them, one man at a time, and let them talk. And when they showed him photographs of the people they missed, he looked at those photographs the way you look at something that costs you something to look at. One of the nurses on duty that night, a woman named Patricia Olson, who had been at the hospital for 11 years, and had seen more famous visitors than she could count, said afterward that she had watched Wayne from the end of the corridor for a while before she realized what she was seeing. She said that when celebrities visited the ward, most of them were good about it, but you could always feel the performance in it, the consciousness of doing a kind thing in a way that was also something else. She said Wayne had no performance in him that night. She said he sat with a boy from Tennessee who had lost both legs and who had not spoken to anyone in 2 weeks. And she said she watched Wayne hold that boy's hand and not say anything at all for 25 minutes. And at the end of the 25 minutes, the boy from Tennessee said something to him, and Wayne said something back, and she could not hear what either of them said, but the boy looked different afterward. She said she did not know how else to describe it. She said he looked like a person again, and she meant it exactly as simply as it sounded. At 11:30 that night, walking back through the corridor toward the parking lot, he turned a corner and nearly walked into Henry Fonda. Fonda was there for the same reason. He had also been invited by a chaplain, different wing, same night, by the kind of scheduling accident that feels, in retrospect, like it must have been arranged by someone. They stood in the corridor and looked at each other for a long moment. The last time they had been in the same room was at a studio function 4 years earlier, before the Green Berets, before the argument had gotten so large that even breathing the same air felt like a statement. Neither man said anything for what one of the orderlies who witnessed the moment would later describe as probably the longest 30 seconds of his life. Then John Wayne said, "I didn't know you'd be here." And Henry Fonda said, "I didn't know you'd be here either." And that was all. They did not shake hands. They did not stop. They walked in opposite directions toward their separate cars and drove separately into the California night, and neither of them told anyone what had happened in that corridor. Not their families, not their friends, not the press, not their agents. They kept it the way men of that generation kept certain things, which is to say they put it somewhere private and did not look at it directly and carried it for the next 7 years. But John Wayne did one thing before he left the parking lot that night. He reached into the glove compartment and he found the only thing available, which was a dry cleaning receipt. and he turned it over, and in the dark of the car with only the parking lot light coming through the window, he wrote 7 words on the back of it and put it in his jacket pocket. He wrote it the way he wrote everything, without drama, without thinking about whether it was the right thing to say, because it was simply true, and he had spent the night sitting with boys who had given everything and had not been given enough in return. He wrote, "The boys deserved better than all of us." He kept it in his wallet for 7 years. What happened next is something the producers of The Tonight Show would spend the rest of their careers describing in terms of pure instinct because there was no playbook for it. Henry Fonda walked to the center of the stage. He stopped. He looked at John Wayne, who had not moved from his chair. And Henry Fonda said in a voice that carried to every corner of the studio and every microphone in the room, "I read the interview, Duke, the one in Time magazine, where you said the kids who protested the war were traitors." The studio went silent, the way a room goes silent when something true has been said and the truth is unpleasant. John Wayne looked at him. His expression did not change. He said, "I said what I believed." And Fonda said, "I know you did. So did the 58,000 boys who died over there because the people who sent them believed things too." The silence in the room after that sentence was different from the silence that came before it. The silence before had been held. This silence fell. It dropped through the audience like something heavy dropping through water. And by the time it reached the floor, everyone in the room could feel it sitting there between the 2 men on the stage. Johnny Carson did not move. He would say later that in 17 years of hosting, he had learned to read a room the way a sailor reads weather, and that what he read in that moment was not danger but something rarer and more difficult to navigate, which was 2 people telling the truth to each other in public. He said the instinct was to smooth it, to find the joke, to release the pressure the way he had released pressure 1,000 times before. He said he sat on his hands instead, figuratively speaking. He said he understood that the pressure was not the problem. The pressure was the point. John Wayne looked at the floor for a moment. When he looked back up, he said, "I know how many died, Hank. I carry that number too. Not the same way you do, but I carry it." Fonda said, "Then why did you make the film?" Wayne was quiet for a moment. He said, "Because somebody had to say they didn't die for nothing. Because I watched those boys come home and nobody was saying that. Everybody was telling them it was a mistake, it was a lie, it was wrong. And some of those boys needed to hear that what they did meant something. Even if the politics were wrong, even if I was wrong about the politics, the boys weren't wrong to serve." Fonda looked at him for a long time. He said, "I agree with that. I have always agreed with that." And Wayne said, "I know you have. That's what makes this so stupid." The studio audience did not make a sound. Not a whisper, not a cough. 308 people sat perfectly still, and the cameras stayed on. Because nobody in the control room reached for the commercial break button, either because they were too stunned or because they understood on some level that cutting away would be the wrong thing to do. Johnny Carson sat between these 2 men with his hands flat on the desk and the particular stillness of someone who knows that the most important thing he can do right now is not speak. John Wayne said, "I never said they should have died. I said the cause was worth dying for. There's a difference." Henry Fonda said, "Is there? Because I went to that hospital, the same one you went to. I sat with those boys, and not one of them talked to me about the cause. They talked to me about the people they were missing. They talked about going home. They weren't dying for a cause, Duke. They were dying because they were 20 years old, and they didn't have a way out of it." John Wayne's jaw tightened. The camera caught it. He said, "Some things are worth fighting for." And Fonda said, quietly in a voice that had nothing theatrical in it at all, "I know that. I fought in a war." "Did you?" The silence that followed that question was the kind of silence that has weight. You could feel it pressing on the room. Johnny Carson looked at the desk. He did not try to intervene. He did not reach for a joke, which would have been his first instinct in almost any other situation, because there are moments when the instinct to smooth things over is the wrong instinct, and Johnny Carson had been alive long enough to know when one of those moments had arrived. John Wayne sat very still for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. The bravado was still there, the way the shape of a building is still there after the fire has gone through it, but something underneath had changed. He said, "No, I did not. And I have thought about that every day for 30 years. Is that what you came here to say, Hank?" And Henry Fonda, who had been standing since he walked on stage, pulled the guest chair that the production assistant had placed to the side and sat down in it and looked directly at John Wayne and said, "No, that is not what I came here to say. I came here because I heard you were sick, and because there is something I should have said a long time ago, and I am running out of time to say it. Same as you." Johnny Carson, without looking up from the desk, said very quietly, "What is it?" And Fonda said, "I came to say that I think we both did what we did because we loved the same thing. We just couldn't see it in each other. And by the time I figured that out, it felt too late to say it, which was stupid because it is never actually too late until you are dead, and we are not dead yet." John Wayne looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his brown Western blazer, and he produced something small, something that had been folded and refolded so many times it was soft at the creases, something the color of old paper, and he unfolded it slowly on the desk, and he slid it across toward Henry Fonda. Fonda looked at it. Johnny Carson looked at it. It was a dry cleaning receipt, turned over, with 7 words written on the back in a hand that was unmistakably the hand of a man who had been writing his name for 50 years. "The boys deserved better than all of us." Henry Fonda read it. He read it again. He set it back on the desk, and he pressed his fingers flat against it, the way you press your fingers against something you want to hold still. And then Henry Fonda, the man who had stood in a room with 12 angry men and never lost his composure, covered his eyes with his right hand and did not speak for a very long time. The studio was so quiet that you could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. You could hear faintly the sound of a camera repositioning itself on its track. 308 people sat in the audience of The Tonight Show, and none of them moved because they understood, in the wordless way that people understand certain things, that the man with his hand over his eyes needed a minute. There was actually a minute, not a television minute, not the compressed and accelerated time of broadcast, but a real 60 seconds in which nothing was required of him. Johnny Carson let it happen. He sat back slightly in his chair, and he let it happen, and he did not reach for anything. Not a note card, not a pen, not the glass of water on the desk. He sat with his hands in his lap, and he let Henry Fonda have his minute. And that restraint, that choice to let a moment breathe instead of filling it, was perhaps the best thing Johnny Carson ever did in 17 years of sitting behind that desk. After a while, Fonda took his hand away from his face. The eyes were wet, and he did not apologize for it. He said, "I have been carrying something for 7 years, and I did not know what it was until just now." He looked at the receipt. He said, "It was this. It was knowing that you were there that night, and that we were there for the same reason, and that neither of us said anything to the other, and that we just went home." He looked at Wayne. "I should have stopped. I should have stopped in that corridor and said something." Wayne said, "So should I." Fonda said, "Why didn't you?" Wayne said, "Same reason you didn't. I didn't know what I would have said. I still don't know what I would have said. Maybe just what I wrote on the back of that receipt. Maybe that's all there was to say." Fonda looked at the receipt again. He said, "It's enough. It's more than enough." Johnny Carson, watching this, felt something happening in his own chest that he did not have words for, and would spend 2 years trying to describe in interviews. He said afterward that it was the only moment in 30 years of hosting when he understood that his job had never been to make people laugh. His job had always been to make the space where something true could happen. That was the whole job. The laughter was just how you got people through the door. After a while, Fonda took his hand away from his face. His eyes were wet. He did not try to pretend they were not. He said, "Where did you write that?" Wayne said, "In the parking lot of St. Mary's Hospital in Anaheim, October of 1972. I had a dry cleaning receipt." Fonda said, "I know. I was there." Wayne said, "I know you were." They looked at each other. Wayne said, "We could have talked to each other then." Fonda said, "We could have." Wayne said, "Why didn't we?" Fonda was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because we were still performing for different audiences, but performing. And you can't actually talk to someone while you're performing for them." John Wayne looked at the receipt on the desk. He said, "You're right. And I've been performing since 1939, and I am very tired of it." He picked up the receipt and he held it out toward Fonda. "I wrote it. You should have it." Fonda took it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he folded it very carefully along the same creases and put it in the breast pocket of his navy jacket. He said, "I'll keep it with me." Wayne said, "Good. That's where it belongs." The studio audience had been silent for a long time. So long that it had become something other than audience silence. It had become the silence of people who understand they are witnesses to something that does not happen very often on any stage anywhere. The silence of people who will spend the rest of their lives trying to describe to their children and their grandchildren what it felt like to be in that room. One of the camera operators said afterward that he had been working in television for 16 years and that in all that time he had never cried on the set. He cried that night. He said he was not embarrassed about it. He said he would not have been embarrassed about it for anything. Johnny Carson looked at his two guests. He looked at the receipt that had disappeared into Henry Fonda's pocket. He looked at the audience, and then he looked at the camera, the way he always looked at the camera when he was about to say something he meant. He said, "I have been sitting at this desk for 17 years. I have talked to presidents and astronauts and the greatest entertainers in the world, and I have never understood, until tonight, what this desk is actually for." He paused. He looked at Wayne. He looked at Fonda. He said, "It is for this. This is the whole point." The broadcast ran 41 minutes over its scheduled length. NBC received 11,000 calls before midnight. Switchboards across the country were jammed by 1 in the morning. The calls were not about John Wayne. They were not about Henry Fonda. They were about fathers and sons who had argued about Vietnam and stopped speaking. They were about brothers who had never found their way back to each other. They were about the particular grief of two people who are on the same side of something and cannot see it, and the relief, the enormous relief, of finally being in a room where someone else has named that thing out loud. The two switchboard operators who stayed on duty through the night said later that they had expected the calls to be the usual kind, people wanting to register opinions, people who felt strongly one way or the other and needed to say so to someone. Instead, the calls were almost uniformly quiet. Person after person calling not to argue but to say something simple. A woman from Georgia who said she had not spoken to her brother since 1968 and that she was going to call him in the morning. A man from Oregon who said he was a veteran and that he had watched the broadcast with his wife and that for the first time she had understood something about what he carried that he had never been able to explain. A man from Michigan who said he had protested the war and that watching Wayne sit in that chair and say what he said had broken something open in him that he had not known was closed. The calls kept coming through the night and into the morning, and every one of them was some version of the same thing, which was, "I needed someone to say that, and I did not know I needed it until they did." Veterans organizations reported a significant increase in people reaching out to estranged family members in the weeks following the broadcast. Mental health lines reported something similar. The producers of the show kept the tape running an extra hour after the broadcast ended, and the calls kept coming, and all of them were some version of the same call, which was, "I needed to hear that, and I did not know I needed to hear it until just now." John Wayne never returned to The Tonight Show. He died on June the 11th, 1979, 4 months after that evening. He died of stomach cancer at the UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles. He was 72 years old. Among the things found in his personal effects was a photograph that nobody in his family had ever seen, a photograph of two men in a corridor at St. Mary's Hospital in Anaheim in 1972, standing across from each other in the fluorescent light. The photograph had been taken by an orderly who recognized them both and produced a disposable camera from somewhere, and they had let him take it, and he had sent them each a copy, and neither of them had ever mentioned it publicly. On the back of Wayne's copy, in Fonda's handwriting, were 4 words. They said, "We were both right." Henry Fonda kept the dry cleaning receipt until he died in August of 1982. His family found it in his jacket. They did not know what it was at first. Then one of his children remembered the broadcast, remembered watching it and understanding something that she had not been able to put into words at the time, and she read the 7 words on the back of the receipt and understood what her father had been keeping. The receipt is held now in a private collection. It has never been publicly displayed. But the 7 words on it, the words that John Wayne wrote in a parking lot in 1972 because he had spent the night with boys who had given everything and felt, sitting in that car, that he had not given enough. Those words have been reprinted and referenced and quoted by veterans and families and people who simply needed something true to say about a thing that had been very hard to say anything true about for a very long time. The boys deserved better than all of us. There is one more thing. It is small and it matters. In the weeks after the broadcast, a letter arrived at NBC addressed to Johnny Carson from a man in Dayton, Ohio, who said he was a Vietnam veteran and that he had watched the broadcast with his father, who had supported the war, and that for the first time in 9 years they had been in the same room without arguing. He said they had sat and watched, and at the end his father had turned to him and said, simply, "I should have listened more." The man said he did not know what to do with that. He said he cried for an hour after his father said it, and did not know if they were the right kind of tears. He said he was writing because he thought Johnny Carson should know that the broadcast had mattered to someone specific in a specific living room in Dayton, Ohio, and that it would continue to matter for as long as he could remember it, which he intended to do. Johnny Carson read the letter on the air 3 weeks later. He did not editorialize. He simply read it all the way through, and then he set it on the desk and said, that is why we do this. And then the cameras cut to commercial and the show went on, the way the show always went on, the way it was supposed to, with something new in the room that had not been there before. Something that was not quite hope and not quite peace, but was at least the beginning of the conversation that comes before both of those things, which is usually the hardest part. The beginning, saying the words when you do not yet know what they will lead to, saying them anyway, trusting that the other person in the room has the same crack in them that you have in you, and that the light will eventually find it, and that the finding when it happens might just be enough. If this story moved you, there is something you can do right now that takes no time at all. Go join the channel. Become one of the people keeping these stories alive, the ones that did not make the official record, the ones that happened in corridors and parking lots and on stages that are long gone now but whose echoes are still running. Tap the join button and see what is waiting for you inside. It is the best way to tell us that you want more of this, and we want to keep telling it. And if you want to help even more, share this video with one person, not a list. One person. Someone who argued with someone they love about something that mattered and has not found their way back yet. Because the beginning of the way back is usually just watching 2 stubborn men on a television set admit that they were both looking at the same thing from different windows, and that neither window was the whole view. Hit subscribe if you haven't yet, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because this story is landing somewhere new every day and I want to know where. And if you have your own version of that parking lot, your own 7 words that you have been carrying for too long, you are allowed to set them down now. You are allowed to say them. The person who needs to hear them is probably closer than you think, and it is not too late. It is not too late until it is, and tonight it is not.